Hey guys, how you doing? We're back for more government stuff and looked over the list that your teacher sent out to study for this week's quiz. I hope last week's video helped. This week we're going to be talking a lot about the Senate, or a lot about Congress and the legislative branch and how that operates and how that works. But before we get into that, one of the things your teacher put in this was the purpose of government according to the preamble. Now, when I taught government, the preamble was the first thing that I taught. It was to me, it set up the rest of the document of the Constitution. It really set up how to interpret the Constitution. And so, while you're not my students and I can't require it, when I taught, it was one of those things I required my students to memorize the preamble to the Constitution. And because it does, it outlines what the purpose of government is according to our Constitution. And so as we look at that, what we're going to find out is that there are six purposes. And so the preamble basically states that we, the people of the United States of America, in order to form a more perfect union. So there's the first purpose of government, to form a more perfect union. I want you to think about that phrase, a more perfect union. In other words, the Founding Fathers realized that as good as this document may be, and as good a job as it might do in establishing our government, there was room for improvement. And I think that's something that we can all agree on as we have studied American history, that as history has marched on, that America hasn't always gotten it right. There have been areas that are parts of our history that aren't pretty, that aren't good, that aren't nice, that we've had to go back and we've had to look at, and we've had to make changes. Civil rights movement, things like that. Slavery is the huge one that is a black eye on our nation, and really one that we have to own up to. And as we look at those things, we realize that our Founding Fathers were wise enough to sit there and say, we might not have it perfect, but part of government is to form a more perfect union, to make it better, to improve on the union and the land that we have, to improve on the government that we have. And so that's the first part. In order to form a more perfect union, to establish justice is the second purpose of government, to establish justice. In other words, we are going to be a nation of laws. There is going to be right, there's going to be wrong, and wrongdoers are going to be punished. And so that's what that means, to establish justice, that those who do right are rewarded, those who do wrong are punished. And so that's part two. So part one, form a more perfect union. Part two, establish justice. Part three, to ensure domestic tranquility. What does that mean? It means that those who live here, that they are able to live a peaceful life, that they are able to lead their own lives and be able to do so in as peaceable a manner as possible. So the government's job there is to ensure that the citizens of that nation are able to lead peaceable lives, to be as peaceful as they can. The fourth purpose of government is to provide for the common defense. In other words, it's to protect the people. Okay, so in order to have domestic tranquility, there has to be some protection. Now, this takes place in several different ways, but federally, nationally, according to the Constitution, there's going to be the military. There's also going to be rules in place as far as what's legal, what's not legal, all of those things. So provide for the common defense as part of the purpose of government, is to protect our nation from as the oath of office that many of our senators and congressmen and our president take, to protect against all enemies, both foreign and domestic. And so to provide for the common defense. The fifth one, to promote the general welfare. In other words, to try to make things as good as they can be for the majority of the people, the general welfare. This recognizes that you can't please everybody all of the time, and that there are going to be some laws that no matter what system of government you have, there's always going to be somebody trying to take advantage of the system. That's just what it is. But the overall purpose of government is to promote the general welfare. What is good for the many? What is good for the majority? What is good for the vast majority is going to be how that's interpreted. And the final one is to secure liberty both for ourselves and for our posterity. In simple terms, to secure the blessings of liberty both now and for future generations. In other words, government's not there just to serve my generation. It's there to serve your generation. It's there to serve your children's generation when you have children, your grandchildren. That's the purpose of government according to the Constitution's preamble. So let me go over those 6 things real quick one more time. 1, to establish a more perfect union. 2, to establish justice. 3, to provide for the common defense. 4 3 is to ensure domestic tranquility. 4 is to provide for the common defense. 5, promote general welfare. 6, secure liberty for both now and in the future. So those are your 6 purposes of government. I encourage you, if you have a copy of the Constitution at home, read that preamble. If you don't, look it up online and read it. If you want to and be nerdy like I am and memorize it, that'd be awesome. But I can't make you do that. But it is something that I think every United States citizen should know, and that they should be able to tell you what the purpose of government is. So we're moving on to Congress and moving on to how Congress is established and all of those things. If the Supreme Court, which we learned about a couple weeks ago, is the head of the judicial branch, then Congress is the largest body of the legislative branch. The legislative branch's job is to write law. That is their job, is to write and make laws. And so this brings us to Congress. How does our Constitution set up our Congress? And how are they elected? And all of those things. So before we get into that, let's look at how Congress is set up. Congress is divided into 2 houses, and there's what they call the upper house. This is the Senate, and the lower house, which is the House of Representatives. Now, this structure is called a bicameral structure. The word bicameral literally means that there are 2 houses to Congress. So Congress is bicameral. Most of the states are bicameral as well. Virginia is bicameral. In fact, this week we had a general election, and that election was not only for governor, it was also for the House of Delegates for Virginia. And so our Senate in Virginia, or our Congress in Virginia, is bicameral. The exception to this is Nebraska. Nebraska has a unicameral Congress. In other words, there's only 1 house. But ours is 2 houses. And this came about because of what was known as the Great Compromise of 1787. And as the framers of the Constitution, they were getting together, they were trying to figure out how to set up our government and how they wanted it. The states wanted different things. The states with a high population, the states with the most people, think the New York, Massachusetts, Virginia at the time was one of the largest colonies, or one of the largest states. These states wanted representation based on population. And it makes sense. We have more people, we should have more say, is kind of what their argument was. However, smaller states like Delaware, Rhode Island, and states like that had a very small population, they wanted equal representation. They're like, if Virginia and New York get all the votes, then everything's always going to go Virginia and New York's way. And think about it today. The states that have the highest population, California, New York, those states, if every election was just those states and our representatives only came by population, then everything would always go the way of New York, California, and things like that. Now, some of you might like that. Some of you probably would not. Where would Virginia's voice be heard in cases like that? Where would smaller states with smaller populations, how would they get their voice heard? And so in 1787, they came up with a compromise. They said, we'll have Congress divided into 2 houses. The upper house will be the Senate, and that will have equal representation. Every state will have 2 senators, and those will be chosen by popular election. And so every state will have 2 senators that serve, and therefore, right now we have 50 states, which means we have 100 senators, two from each state, and so there's equal representation. The lower house is the House of Representatives. And in this body, we will have it based on population. And so, in the Senate, equal representation. In the House, there is representatives that are there based on population. So you guessed it, California's got more representatives than anybody in the House. But in the Senate, they're just like everybody else. They have 2. And so for a bill to become a law, it has to go through not only the House, it has to go through the Senate too. Now, this was done to prevent what is known as tyranny of the majority. Okay, and what tyranny of the majority basically is, it's that majority rules. But if you know anything about history, you know that the majority is not always right. The majority is not always correct, and the majority can often make laws that hurt a large portion of the minority. And so, with that being the case, this way of setting up our legislative branch really prevents that tyranny of the majority. It allows for the majority to have their voice heard, and allows for them to be able to push things through the House and things like that. But they have to do it in such a way that it clears the Senate. And so that is a bicameral structure. You have the Senate based on equal representation. You have the House of Representatives based on population. Now, let's go over some differences between these 2 houses. Senators, first of all, those elected to the Senate, they are elected to 6-year terms. Okay, so that's even longer than the president. The president is elected to 4-year terms. Now, neither with the Senate or the House of Representatives, there's not term limits for either one. So they can, as long as they can keep winning elections, they can stay in there. But in the Senate, it is 6-year terms. In the House, it is 2-year terms. So they're up for re-election every 2 years in the House of Representatives. The Senate, as I've already said, 2 members per state, 50 states, that's 100 members. The House is 435, and that's a set number. It's going to be 435 divided up, and we'll get into how they do that in a minute, divided up according to population. So 100 members in the Senate, 435 in the House, which means there's 535 members of Congress total. The Senate is in job, let's go over one of the things that the legislative branch does here. One of their jobs is to check the executive branch, to check the office of the president, to check that power. How does these 2 houses do that? Well, in the Senate, one way that they are able to check the power of the executive branch is it is their job to approve of presidential appointments. When a president appoints judges to be on the Supreme Court or federal courts, when the president appoints different offices, the Senate has to approve that. It has to go through the Senate and be approved by the Senate. So that way the president just isn't picking willy-nilly. He has to pick people that are going to get approved by the Senate. The House of Representatives, their ability to check presidential power comes in that all impeachment proceedings start in the House. It is the House that has to bring forth impeachment, not the Senate. Now, eventually an impeachment trial will go through the Senate, but it is the House that starts that. So those are some of the differences between the House of Representatives and the Senate. As we look at the Senate, there is a certain hierarchy in there, and hierarchy is just a fancy word for how is the power organized. And so this is one of the things on your quiz this week, according to your email. And so we're going to look at different offices within the Senate. We're going to look at 6 major offices in the Senate. One is the President of the Senate. Sounds like a weird term. This is not the President of the United States. This is the President of the Senate. And the job of the President of the Senate is simply to preside, that's where we get our word president, preside over the Senate. The President of the Senate is not a senator. It is not a member of Congress. The president of the Senate is the vice president of the United States. That's their job, is to sit over to preside over the Senate. The president of the Senate only votes if there's a tie. If you've got two representatives from every state, then that means there's a possibility that a bill gets voted on and you got 50 voting for and 50 voting against. Well, how do you break that tie? How do you get this out of the Senate? The cases, the vice president gets to cast that vote. That's the only time the vice president gets to cast a vote is when when there is a tie. But that is the vice president's job. So the president of the Senate is the vice president. Now, there is the president pro tempore, or a lot of times you'll hear president pro temp. This is somebody who's selected by the Senate, and they serve as president of the Senate. It's a senator, and they serve as president of the senator if the vice president can't be there. If the vice president is somehow incapacitated or somehow away on a different job or something like that, then the president pro temp is the one who comes in and does that. So that's the president pro tempore, Tempore, if you're writing this down. So you got the president of the Senate, who's the vice president of the United States. You have President tempore, who's a senator chosen by the rest of the Senate. And then under that, you have what are known as leaders and whips. First of all, you'll have the majority leader. This is chosen by the party that has more senators. And so the majority leader, their job is they get to decide what issues that Senate is going to really back and try to push forward and push through into law and things like that. And so that's the majority leader's job. And then you have the majority whip. The majority whip's job is to whip up support for those bills. That's why they call them the whip. And so their job is to go out there and talk to the other senators and say, hey, we're pushing this through. We want to know if we can have your support. And they will talk to senators on both sides of the aisle. They will talk to senators from both parties, their party and other parties, as well as any third-party senators. They will talk to anybody they think might side with them on an issue or on a bill. And so that's their job. Now, the minority party has the same offices. You have the minority leader and you have the minority whip. And so the minority leader, you guessed it, they're going to do the same thing. They're going to decide these are the bills and these are the issues that we're going to support for this term, and these are the things that we're going to oppose in this term. And the minority whip, their job is the same as the majority whip. They are to go out there and whip up support for their side. And so those are the six offices within the Senate. There's a lot of other little ones, but those are the six major ones that you're going to hear about in the news a lot. The majority leader right now is Chuck Schumer. He's a Democrat out of, I can't remember if it's New York or California, one of the big ones. But Chuck Schumer is the majority leader. The minority leader is Mitch McConnell from Kentucky. And so if you're hearing those two guys' names in the news a lot, that's why. They're kind of the voice of their party within the Senate, and so you got president of the Senate, the president pro tempore. You got majority leader, majority whip, minority leader, minority whip. So those are your hierarchy within the Senate. Those things now. The Senate and Congress in general has a lot to get done. They not only pass laws, but they also handle the budget of the country and all of those things. And so there's a lot of committees, congressional committees that are formed. In fact, our Congress right now has around 200 different committees and subcommittees that are formed that are helping run our government. Now, there are three major types of committees. The first major type is a standing committee. A standing committee is a permanent committee. It's going to be there, as it's approved by the congressional rules. It's always going to be there. It's usually things like budget. If you hear the Appropriations Committee met, that's one of the standing committees of Congress. The Appropriations Committee basically determines what money goes where. The Budget Committee determines how much is spent. The Appropriations Committee determines how that's divided. And so those are standing committees. Then you have what are called select or special committees. These can be permanent or temporary, as the case may be. They usually conduct studies or investigations, like if somebody's being investigated or there's a study. For instance, example of one is they had a committee on aging when they were trying to figure out Social Security reform and things like that. And so these are selective. And the reason they call them select or special is that those who are appointed to them they're usually very selective about who they appoint to them. It might be people who have a specific knowledge of that subject, or it might be just leaders from within the Congress and Senate. But those are select. Then the third type is joint committees. Joint committees are made of both senators and representatives. So they have members from both houses, so they're a joint committee. The other committees are usually within just the Senate or just the House of Representatives. A joint committee has members from both, and again, just like select and special committees, these can be temporary or permanent, as the case may be. They usually handle issues that affect both houses, things like that. Usually what we would call housekeeping issues, things like handling office supply use and stuff like that. It's very minor stuff, but it's stuff that affects both houses. Now, we've already talked about that the House of Representatives is determined by population, and that there's 435 members of the House, and that's divided up. Well, what happens when you have a state like right now? If you were to look at what's happening, a lot of people are moving out of California because of a lot of different reasons. Some of it has to do with high taxes. Some of it has to do with the drought that's been going on there. There's a lot of different reasons that people are moving out of California. And so there's this exodus from California right now. I don't know if it's been enough to affect the districting or anything like that, but a lot of those people moving out of California are moving to Texas. And so how do you determine, okay, when do they lose enough people that they start losing representatives in the House? How is that determined? Well, that is determined through the process of redistricting. Redistricting occurs every 10 years with the census. Basically, they get the census results in every 10 years. They do a census, they look at that, and they use those numbers to determine how many delegates come from each state. How many representatives do each state gets? Another term for this is reappropriation. And so that's what it is. Redistricting is when they look at the states and they look at the population and they determine, okay, this state now has less delegates. Well, if you're doing that, a delegate represents a different district within that state. And so as you sit there and you look at that and see how many districts are in that state, and you look at that, well, if you're losing delegates, then that means you're losing a district. And if you lose a district, that means the borders of that district or the lines of that district have to be redrawn. And so that process is called redistricting. So reappropriation is when you change the number of delegates from a certain state because population has either grown in that state or has shrunk in that state to the degree that it needs that. And redistricting occurs when that happens. If a state gets bigger and they add a district, well, then you've got to redraw those lines. If a state gets smaller and you take away a district, then those lines again need to be redrawn. And so that is redistricting. Now, with redistricting comes the danger of gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is drawing the lines of a district in such a way that it favors one party greatly over another. Okay, redistricting is supposed to be done by population. So it makes sense, like, okay, let's take Virginia, for instance. Okay, most of our population lives in either Northern Virginia or it lives out in the Hampton Roads, Virginia Beach area. That's where most of our population is. You do have some cities like Richmond, Roanoke, Charlottesville that might get their own district, but for the most part, that our population density is mostly Northern Virginia and out on the coast near Virginia Beach. And so it makes sense that the districts up in Northern Virginia are going to be smaller than the districts here in Southside Virginia. And because it's not based on land, it is based on population. And now what happens in gerrymandering is when they sit there and they look at it and they go, okay, we can draw a bunch of small districts here in this very heavily populated area, but rather than just, do a square block or something like that, then they start drawing it in such a way that it's like, well, we know this part of town is heavily Democrat, and we don't want them voting in our election or swaying this district so much. And so what happens, it usually happens when you're adding a district, okay, not when you're taking one away. What usually happens when they add a district is they go to the most populous places and they sit there and one party looks at it and goes, how can we draw this to where the district we add is our district? And that's gerrymandering, and gerrymandering's illegal. You can't do it. If it's determined that happens, then you have to go back all the way back to the drawing board and redraw the districts. And so gerrymandering is the practice of drawing a district in such a way that it heavily favors one party over the other. So that is how redistricting and gerrymandering works. As we look at the process of lawmaking and the process of spending, because that's one of the things that Congress does, they are in charge of spending. They're in charge of how money is spent in this country. We have to look at the practice of what is called pork barrel spending. If you've ever heard a politician who's running for Senate or running for Congress and they use the phrase, I will cut pork while I'm in office. That doesn't mean that he's slicing bacon, okay? That's not what that means. What that means is that he is going to cut unnecessary spending. Pork barrel spending is what happens when lawmakers make a piece of legislation. And as they're making that legislation, the whips are going around trying to whip up support. And what will happen is the whip, let's say, the whip is like, okay, we are 3 votes away from being able to pass this bill. And so they go to somebody, and it might be somebody from the other party. And they're like, what can I do to get you to vote for this bill? And the senator or the congressman from that state will sit there and they'll look at the bill and say, well, I have been trying to get funding for this project in my district. Is there a way that you can just tack that into the bill a little bit? Is there a way that you can just add that in? If you add that in, then I'll vote for this bill. It might have nothing to do whatsoever with the legislation that's being passed, but it's a way of redirecting funds, redirecting money to their specific district, and that is called pork barrel spending. And this is why you get bills coming through Congress that instead of being 5-6 pages long for one law, they are hundreds of pages long. It is because each senator, each representative is in there saying, well, I will support it if you tack this little bit of spending for my little pet project here onto it. And so it's a way of funneling funds to their constituents. Okay? Congressmen are the representatives. Constituents are who they represent. They're the people living in their district. And so that's who constituents are. And so pork barrel spending is a way of directing the funds to to their constituents or to their district. And so such spending practices are done usually to try to get votes. That's it. If a congressman can go home to his district that he's trying to win and say, look at this project, I brought these projects here, I brought this money into this area, I put this, it's done to get reelected. Now, the problem with this is this leads to what is known as career politicians. People that their entire career, and I mean, you sit there and you look at office at Congress and you look at senators, they're people that have been serving there for 30 years. And the reason they're able to do that is because they do this. They go in and they lie. They're able to redirect all these funds to their district and all of those things. And the problem is, instead of looking at what is good for the entire nation, who is the laws that they're passing are going to affect is the entire nation, they're only looking out for their district. Now, they are there to represent their district to a certain degree, but if your job is only to get reelected and not to do what is good for the nation as a whole, that's going to change your perspective on how you do your job. And so pork barrel spending has led to a lot of issues. And so this is one of the things that a lot of people recognize. It's not a good thing. It's not our spending is way out of control on the federal level. And so as you look at this and recognize that, then that means that politicians, they know when to say that phrase. If I get into office, I will cut pork. Like any promise of a politician, believe it when you see it, is all I'm going to say. As bills get passed into law, they're debated. Okay, and so what that means is that whether it starts in the House or it starts in the Senate, usually what happens with a bill, first of all, it's talked about in a committee. Okay, we've already talked about committees. The committee will draft the bill. The committee will present the bill to Congress if it gets approved by the committee, and depending on where it starts, whether in the House of Representatives or the Senate, it will be debated on the Senate floor or the chamber floor of the House of Representatives. And they will debate it. They will talk about it. They will sit there and talk about the pros and cons of it. They might sit there and say, okay, we'll vote to approve it if you amend it, if you take this part out or add this part in. All of that is going on during the debate. But let's say there's a controversial piece of legislation coming up, and it looks like it's going to pass. And, because in order to pass, you just need a simple majority. And so a tool that is out there for the minority party to use, or the minority of who's trying to get this bill passed to use, is what's known as a filibuster. You might have heard of this recently because there have been a lot of filibusters recently. And basically what a filibuster is, it is a form of congressional debate. And it's meant to delay or even prevent a vote from taking place. And so what a filibuster is when senators or House of Representatives decide to debate a bill endlessly because there's no time limit. As long as the senator or the House member has the floor, as long as he's standing up, he's allowed to speak. And there's no way to cut him short. There's no way to stop him from speaking. Well, if you get a group of congressmen doing this that are all spending hours and hours, and they can say anything. They can say they don't have to debate the bill. They can talk about anything. They can get up there and read the dictionary if they want to. And if you've got a whole group of people doing this, well, then it can lead to some really long sessions of Congress. In fact, today they have what is known as the silent filibuster, because the only way to break a filibuster is one of two ways. One is that the one side, or one of three ways. One is that the one side finally runs out of stuff to say. They finally have, all the senators have been given their chance to speak. They've all spoken for a really long time. You just wait it out, and then you go ahead and vote because they have nothing left to say and have nothing left to do. This is what happened with the 1967 Civil Rights Act. There was an 83-day long filibuster on that, led mostly by Southern senators, but 83 days of filibuster on the 67 Civil Rights Act. And they just waited it out. They waited for 83 days for this to end. Second way to end it is just withdraw the bill. And this happens about 25-30% of the time. The bill is just withdrawn. The senators are like, it's not worth the fight. It's not worth sitting here for hours listening to this or whatever. And they withdraw it. The third and final way is to vote to end debate. However, to vote to end debate, you don't need a simple majority. In the Senate, you need a 60-40 vote. You need 60% of the votes in order to break or to end the debate. And so this means that a law that only needs 51% to pass, if you filibuster it, it actually needs 60% to end the filibuster. And so a silent filibuster occurs when one side recognizes we don't have 60%. Rather than sit here for hours, we're going to wait until we do have 60%, and then we'll vote to end debate. And so they're not sitting there for hours listening to. The longest that one person has ever done a filibuster was just over 24 hours. It's like 24 hours and 18 minutes. Was Strom Thurmond from South Carolina in the 1950s, also on a civil rights bill. The bill to end segregation in public schools is what he was trying to do. So the filibuster filibuster, it has a inglorious history. It was usually used, especially in the 60s and 50s, for civil rights things. It was used to defend Jim Crow laws in the 20s. The filibuster has often been used for a lot of not good things. There's been talk of ending the filibuster because there has been such an increase in use of it. Since 1917, when the filibuster really first came into practice, since 1917, there have been about 2,000 different filibusters. However, nearly half of them have just been in the last 17 years. And so what this does is it just creates a logjam. Congress can't get anything done. And so there's been talk of ending the filibuster. I don't know if it will, if they'll ever vote to end it, because it does give the minority party a voice, but it also log jams a lot of different things. But that's a filibuster, if you're wondering what that was. So there you go. That is this week's quiz in a nutshell. I hope I helped you. I hope you're able to get something from this. Until next week, I'll talk to you later. Bye.